demography, health questionnaires, and then to check if these participants they have hypertension, diabetes, or any form of chronic diseases. Then we also took their baseline measurements, including their blood pressure, height, weight, from which we calculated our BMI. So after the baseline data collection, we administered the first food frequency questionnaire to the patients while they were waiting for their clinical appointments in the outpatient clinic. Now, along that, we also collected the first 24 hours dietary recall, because we are looking at how we can validate the food frequency questionnaire using a gold standard, which we felt the 24-hour dietary recall will give us a better way of validating our FFQ. So we did that. Then we also did our second 24-hour dietary recall, but on phone call, and this was done on weekend, on Saturday, and this was done only by phone call. Then on the third visit, on that clinical visit, we administer the third 24-hour dietary recall, which was on a weekday, because we are aiming to administer this 24-hour dietary recall on non-consecutive days, including 2 weekdays and 1 weekend, to be able to see their variability in their food consumption and capture all their dietary pattern or behavior within the week. So the second food frequency questionnaire was administered at the 4th week of clinic visit. That is a follow-up visit, because we wanted to assess the reproducibility of our FFQ. So we decided that we will take the first week and the 4th week with 3 weeks interval. With that, we were able to assess the intake of these participants at the 4th week. Now, at the end of the study, we were able to collate the first FFQ, the first food frequency questionnaire, and the second food frequency questionnaire. Now, we entered the frequency of intake that was filled by each participant into an Excel spreadsheet. And then the response by the participants from the 3 24-hour dietary recall from the 58 patients were also entered into SPSS. And then they were this data, the Excel spreadsheet was now exported into our programming, where we analyze all our validity and reproducibility. Now, we assess the relative validity by first knowing the association between the Nigeria Dietary Screening Tool, which is the FFQ, and that of the 24-hour dietary recall. So we assess, first of all, we inspect the data. We inspect the data to understand if they are normally distributed or non-normally distributed. In our data set, we observe that the data were not normally distributed. Therefore, we use non-parametric method. Instead of using sperma correlation, instead of using Pearson correlation, we use sperma correlation. for our association. So for us to understand the strength of the association between the Nigerian dietary screening tool and the 24 dietary recall, we perform Spearman rank correlation, and then we set greater than 0.3 as our acceptable association. Then we also evaluated the validity using Blunt-Altman analysis, where we were able to assess the level of agreement between the Nigerian dietary screening tool and that of the 24 hours dietary recall. It is important to note that we took the average between the two, the mean value between the first and the second FFQ, or the Nigerian dietary screening tool, for each of the 28 food items. And then we also took the mean value, 24-hour dietary recall, to compare the difference between them. It is observed that, based on our analysis, we observed that there is a similar intake between the Nigerian dietary screening tool and 24-hour dietary recall. 19 food groups. Now, in the Blunt-Altman analysis, we also find out that most of the food groups, there was minimal bias. About 18 food groups have minimal bias. Then when we now look at the agreement level between these two tools, we observe that 95% of all our observation, that is the values, fall within the acceptable limit. The acceptable limit was plus or minus 3 standard deviation of the mean difference. That is the bias. And this indicates a high agreement between the Nigerian dietary screening tool and that of the 24-hour dietary recall. This proves that the Nigerian dietary screening tool is valid to assess these food groups in clinical setting in Nigeria. Now, the next we conducted was to perform the reproducibility of the Nigerian dietary screening tool. This is to assess if the tool can be able to perform similarly in different conditions using the same demography, or how consistent it is for the tool to measure the same outcome, the reason why it was created. And then we assess the reproducibility by looking first the association, the strength of association between the first Nigerian dietary screening that we administer and the second we administer over a period of 3 weeks apart. And we observed that the correlation coefficient, which we perform using Spearman rank correlation, shows that about majority of the food group, about 19 of the food group out of the 20, have a correlation frequency of about 0.7. Now, for us to understand the reliability and also the consistency, we perform what we call the intra-class correlation coefficient, which is ICC. And in our analysis, we observed that the intra-class correlation coefficient was greater than 0.6 for about 17 food group, which gave us a high performance for our tool, the Nigerian dietary screening tool. At the end of the study, we decided to conduct a focus group discussion among patients and also the healthcare professionals. We aim to understand the performance of our tool, the acceptability of our tool, and how they feel confident, especially the healthcare professional, in using this tool. Now, in the course of our feasibility study, we calculated the adherence rate to be about 88%, while the satisfaction in using the tool was about 97%. Study has shown that a tool that have adherence rate above 80 and satisfaction rate above 80 is regarded a tool that can be applied or used in any setting. Now, for the clarity, the easy to use and the cultural appropriateness of the tool, we observed that 97% of the participants reported that the tool was clear to them, it was easy for them to use, and it contained all the food there are commonly eaten in Nigeria. However, some missing food were reported, example, plantain. Then also, we calculated the completion time between the two during their clinic hours, and the average completion time was less than 8. In our study, it was actually about 7.6 minutes. So, which means that within their waiting time during their clinic visit, this questionnaire can be completed in less than 8 minutes. Now, for the healthcare professional, we observed that they reported that it was clear, and it was relevant. And then the satisfaction rate was high, about 97%. And then about 80% of the healthcare professional reported that integrating it in their clinic hours is well tolerated. And there was no concern of whether it's disturbed their workflow or not. However, the major concern that was reported was the time it normally take them to interpret the food frequency questionnaire, the Nigerian dietary screening tool, and to be able to use it immediately to interpret to their patient. Based on this concern, we decided to modify the FFQ to see how it can be suitable for clinicians to use it for their dietary counseling during their clinical hours. So, by way of our first study design on developing the Nigerian dietary screening tool, a better way of validating it, and how it can be used in the clinical setting, we observed that the Nigerian dietary screening tool is easy to use, one, and it is a quick way to check whether people eat in the clinics. Now, for the patients, most people find it that it is easy to use and it is fast to complete. And then they also observe that it is culturally appropriate, meaning that it has the common food that they eat. For the healthcare professional involving doctors, nurses, and dietitians, it is clinically useful, relevant, and it is their work. But the only concern that was noted was the concern of interpretation within the clinic hours. Now, this led us to see how we can simplify the tool for easy interpretation by the healthcare professional. With this, we now ask a question: how can we improve on this Nigerian dietary screening tool for easy interpretation by the clinicians? On that note, we develop another study design to see how we can improve the Nigerian dietary screening tool, and how confident are we that from the Nigerian dietary screening tool, we can develop the Nigerian dietary risk score that can be used by clinicians to assess their patients' risk of hypertension in clinical setting. Now, we recruited 165 participants, and then we administered the Nigerian dietary screening. The validated now is the validated dietary screening tool. We administered it to them, and then we took their anthropometry parameters and blood pressure, especially the mean arterial pressure. Again, we also collected blood sample from a subgroup of 91 participants. Now, these 91 participants have similar anthropometric parameters. They have the difference, there was no significant difference between their demography, their anthropometric parameters with that of the 165 participants. So the blood sample were collected to estimate blood lipids and some inflammatory markers. Now, our aim was to construct and develop the Nigerian dietary risk score, and two, to test if there is an association between the Nigerian dietary risk score and the mean arterial pressure. Now, we have 23 food groups from the Nigerian dietary screening tool that we are reviewed. Now, the participant field and then the frequency of intake from the Nigerian dietary screening tool was converted into a numeric value. We calculated the mean intake per food group, and then we use the Wilcoxon sign rank test to compare the food intake between individuals that are hypertension, that is HT, and those that are non-hypertensive individual. Now, p-value greater than 0.05 was seen. If you look at the slide, you will see our radial plot. Now, in this radial plot, you can see that there are certain food that are at risk of, that are associated with hypertension among participants. For example, salt, alcohol, soft drinks, dessert and sweets. So the pink part of the radial plots are food that we have found that were associated with hypertension. And it was observed that the intake of these food groups between non-hypertensive and hypertensive individual were different. It was observed that hypertensive individuals significantly consume these food groups when compared to non-hypertensive individual. However, there was no difference between the food groups, such as fruit and vegetable, rice, wheat, breakfast cereals, beans, nuts, consumption between non-hypertensive and hypertensive individual. Therefore, using other classification system, we now classify the food groups at the pink side of the radar plot as unhealthy food groups because these food groups were associated with hypertension. However, the food that are on the blue side of the radar plot are healthy food, and they were not associated with an increase in the risk of hypertension. Now, for us to create the Nigerian dietary screening tool, the data that were collected by the Nigerian dietary screening tool, we split the data randomly into two. 80% was used to derive the Nigerian dietary risk score, while 20% was used to validate the Nigerian dietary risk score. Now, in this study, we use internal validation, not external validation. That is why we split the data randomly into 80% validation set and 80% derivation set and 20% validation set. Now, in the 80% derivation set, we perform multivariable logistic regression and in the 23 food groups, and then we set our significance to be less than 0.05. Now, all the food groups that have in the multivariable logistic regression, all the food groups that are significant with a p-value less than 0.05, which are retained because these food groups were associated with what? Hypertension. So they were retained to create the Nigerian dietary risk score. However, food groups that were not associated with hypertension significantly were not used in the creation of this. Now, the aim of this construct is to ensure that we simplify the Nigerian dietary screening tool based on the requirement of the physician, the healthcare professional, in order for them to incorporate it in their routine clinical assessment. So in that note, the beta coefficient for each food group were retained and used as the weight for the score formulation. Now, for us to calculate the score for each participant, we use the beta coefficient, which is the weight of the association between the food group and hypertension and their food intake. For example, let's say that a particular patient food intake was 3 to 5 times per week. We converted the food intake per week to per day. So intake per day. What we did was to add 3 to 5 times. So we added 3 plus 5 divided by 2, and then we got 8, and then divide it by 2, which is 4 divided by 7. With that, we were able to calculate the food intake for each participant per day. So to calculate the score, we multiply the beta coefficient for that particular food times multiply by the food intake per day for that participant. With that, we were able to calculate the score. Here, this is the Nigerian dietary risk score. Now, we were able to identify this food group: eggs and eggs products, red meat, processed meat, fried food, soup and stew, fats and oil, and then salt and seasoning. These food groups, these food items were significantly associated with hypertension. And we use their beta coefficient to calculate the risk score and was able to develop the Nigerian dietary risk score. Now, for egg and vegetable, for any participant that accept or report never or rarely, a point of 0 is given to the participant. However, if any individual report 1 to 2 times per week or more, a point of 3 was assigned. Now, the same follows for other food items. Now, we have a total of about 30 points. Now, based on these points, any individual that score 11 and above is categorized high risk of having hypertension, while individual that score below 11 is categorized as low risk for hypertension. Now, based on our Nigerian dietary risk score, we compared our risk score with international recognized risk score known as the Interheart risk score. And we observed that some of the food groups that were included in our own, tool was absent in the Interheart risk score. This shows that the Interheart risk score is not culturally appropriate for the Nigerian diet. And it shows that the Nigerian dietary risk score can be effectively used to assess individual risks of hypertension using these food groups. Our second aim was to test whether there is an association between the Nigerian dietary risk score and the mean arterial pressure. This is to assess that if we can actually use the Nigerian dietary risk score to predict hypertension risks in Nigeria. Like when we derive the risk score, we use the 80% derivative set to develop the risk score. Now, for our internal validation, we now use our 20% validation set to validate it. Now, we validated the Nigerian dietary risk score using discrimination analysis. Now, in discrimination analysis, we use the receiver operative characteristics area under the curve, and then we use our C statistics and then accuracy measures. These were the parameters that we use to validate the Nigerian dietary risk score. Again, because the Nigerian dietary risk score will be used in a clinical setting, we decided to conduct decision curve analysis. And this decision curve analysis will predict the usefulness, the clinical usefulness of the Nigerian dietary screening tool in a clinical setting. Again, we also need to understand if the Nigerian dietary risk score is associated with known cardiovascular biomarkers. So therefore, we decided to conduct mediation analysis to assess the relationship between the Nigerian dietary risk score, which is the exposed tool, and the mean arterial pressure, which was the outcome, to see whether there is an intermediate in between them that drive this association. On that note, we identify 11 food groups that were associated with hypertension using the Nigerian Dietary Risk Score. Now, we observe that the Nigerian Dietary Score was associated with hypertension. So a 1 unit increase in the risk score increased the odds of hypertension by 2 times, which means that an individual that have a risk, that have their risk score increased by 1, the Nigerian Dietary Risk Score, the increase in hypertension will be increased by 2-fold. Now, we also look at the area under the curve, and we were able to see that the Nigerian Dietary Risk Score can accurately identify and stratify 92% of individuals at risk of hypertension. What does that mean? This means that the Nigerian Dietary Score, when used in a clinical setting, can be able to identify individuals who are at risk of hypertension when compared to those that are not at risk of hypertension. Normally, for area under the curve, a value greater than 70 seems strong. Now, when we compare our Nigerian Dietary Risk Score of 92% and that of the Interhouse Risk Score, Interhouse Risk Score has area under the curve about 71%, while that of the Nigerian Dietary Score have area under the curve in identifying individual at risk of hypertension by 92%. This shows that our risk score outperforms the entire score in assessing the risks of hypertension, especially in sub-Saharan Africa countries. Also, we performed the decision curve analysis, and we observed that now this curve, in this curve, the green line represents when no dietary screening tool was used to assess the risks of hypertension. That is the green line. Now, for the red line, it represents when all participants were screened using the Nigerian Dietary Risk Score. Then, when we looking at the blue line represents the strategy of using the Nigerian Dietary Screening Tool in predicting hypertension risks. And it was observed that using the Nigerian Dietary Risk Score outperformed all the other strategies, one, by not using any dietary screening tool or using other methods of dietary screening tool. Using the Nigerian Dietary Screening Tool in predicting hypertension in a clinical setting, I outperform all the other strategies. This goes on to show that the Nigerian Dietary Screening Tool is valuable and it is useful in predicting the risks of hypertension in clinical setting. Then we went on to conduct our mediation analysis. All these analyses we are performed in our computing environment using other softwares. Now, we looked at the relationship between the Nigerian Dietary Screening Tool, how blood lipids influence hypertension through the Nigerian Dietary Risk Score. And we observed that the effect of Nigerian Dietary Risk Score on hypertension was partially mediated about 47 to 71% by this biomarker, especially the total glyceride low density lipoprotein, total cholesterol, and C-reactive protein, including homocysteine. Now, this goes on to show that if you look at the diagram, this goes on to show that the interaction between the Nigerian dietary risk score and that of hypertension, that is the mean arterial pressure, was mediated by these biomarkers. This is to show that the food that are included in the Nigerian dietary screening tool has the potential of modulating or increasing these iatrogenic lipids and these inflammatory markers. And this shows the mechanism through which these unhealthy food groups in the Nigerian dietary screening tool can increase one risk of hypertension. Now, on that note, we were able to identify 28 food items in the Nigerian dietary screening tool, which was simplified to 11 items in the Nigerian dietary screening tool. It is important to note that this modification or this simplification was as a result of the consign made by healthcare professionals in clinical setting in order for it to be well incorporated in their routine dietary counseling in the clinical setting. Now, these 11 food groups that were included in this Nigeria diet group were all unhealthy food groups. And these food groups were associated with increased risks of hypertension. Now, it is also observed that each unit increase in the Nigerian dietary risk score for an individual doubles the odds of hypertension. It is also observed that the Nigerian dietary screening school demonstrated a predictive accuracy of about 92% in identifying or stratifying individual as high risk individual. And this predictive accuracy outperforms other tools in identifying using dietary tool to identify other Western dietary tool to identify risks, like what we discussed in the Interhealth risk score, which have about 71% in identifying individuals' risks of hypertension in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, it's also observed that cholesterol, C-reactive protein, and homocysteine mediate the relationship between the Nigerian dietary risk score and mean arterial pressure. Now, overall, it is important to note as take home that one, the Nigerian dietary risk score is a simple tool. It is quick to use, it is valid, and it is a reliable tool. And this tool can help to identify and stratify individuals at high risk of hypertension in clinical setting in Nigeria. That's take us to or conclude our talk for the first day. So on that note, I will hand over the mic to Dr. Mike to continue with the presentation.
Hey, thank you very much, Nimi. Really appreciate it. Let me screen share on my end. I'll get it going. Sorry. There we go. There we go. So going back to what we proposed as the outline for these 2 days, day one, that being today, we focused on how and why we have looked at hypertension and the role of dairy, how we informed our first strategy, the Nigerian Dietary Screening Tool, the NIDST, which NIMI validated and demonstrated the reproducibility on. We then further informed it and improved it by developing the Nigerian Dietary Risk Score in order to improve ease of use by patients and the clinicians. And we've demonstrated how its accuracy in predicting individuals at high risk of hypertension and those that have on their way to developing hypertension. And we have, I think, improved the evidence that is building of the role of diet to the problem of hypertension in Nigeria by demonstrating its pathway by which it elicits its effect in order to raise blood pressure levels. So at the moment, we have a tool that's been refined in a single setting in Nigeria at River State University Hospital. And at this point, we are eager to get it out there, but we have to recognize that every region in Nigeria may have certain expectations for the Nigerian dietary screening tool that we don't currently have. And we need to potentially make adaptations to it in order to prove the generalizability for implementation within a clinical setting and across Nigeria. Furthermore, we've only evaluated for adult onset hypertension. There are other cases of hypertension that are at elevated risk in Nigeria and West Africa that we also need to consider going forward. So those are some of the points that we will be touching on tomorrow. So that is the end of day one. And I will pass the microphone back to you. Sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Vatibo and Dr. Michael. Please let's thank our facilitators by reacting with a thumbs up or clap. Great. So we'll move forward with the post-test poll. I will launch the poll now. This test is anonymous and your names won't be shown. And we won't score you. Please take some time to fill out the post-test. While we fill out the post-test, don't forget to ask your questions in the comments. All your questions will be answered accordingly. Thank you very much. We can see after the post-test, those who have questions, who have their hands raised, will have time to ask their questions. Well done. We can see, like I said, the test is anonymous and the answers, and we won't score you. Your names won't also show. Well done. Okay, we can see 15% has answered the question. Well done. About 42% has answered. Well done. Let's keep the ball rolling. So I hear that we cannot ask questions. So please, I apologize. Please, let's write our questions in the comments in order to avoid disorderliness. I apologize once again for the confusion. About 51% have answered. The poll will end in a minute. Please take the time to fill out the poll. Please, if you have any questions, don't forget to put it in the chat box, in the comments. Well done. Well done. 69% has participated. Wow, 72%. Well done. Good job, guys. We'll be ending the poll soon. The poll will be ending now. Please, if you haven't filled the poll, please do that now. Don't forget that in order to avoid disorderliness, we won't be asking or muting our mics to ask our questions. Please don't forget to send your questions in the comment section and it will be answered accordingly. Thank you. The answers to the post test has been shared. Now let's begin the question and answer session. Please don't forget to submit your questions in the comment section and they'll be answered accordingly. So for our first questions, someone would like to know how many repeated 24-hour dietary recalls were used to assess the validity of the Nigerian dietary screening tool and for the relative validity of the 20 food groups.
Sorry, I started answering these already as Nimi was talking. I apologize for that. I wasn't aware of the strategy that we used. So we did 3 24-hour dietary recalls for each participant, and we used the average or mean as their average intake reported by it in order to test for validity.
Great. And then the person also wants to know how many out of those 20 food groups achieved the correlation greater than 0.3.
Fair enough. I'll just read what I already wrote. Again, I apologize. So I'm having to lean in to read it more carefully. So of the 20 food groups, only 2 were below 0.30. Fats and oils and salts and seasonings. One was 0.2, the other was 0.22. So we looked at that and we tried to improve how we asked about those questions in the NIDRS. While all other food groups were well above the range of 0.30, with an average overall of greater than 0.6 for the correlation coefficient.
Okay, interesting. Was there a target population for this study or was it done randomly?
Nimi, would you like to take that one?
Thank you for the question. What we did was that there was no actual target population. We looked at the general distribution of individual, and in our study, we have the 3 major ethnic groups that were represented. the Igbos, the Hausa, and the Yorubas were all represented in our study. So all the major tribes were present in our study from our demography.
Okay. So what other factors was considered during these studies?
Because when we are designing the food frequency questionnaire, we look at the national nutritional guidelines of Nigeria and Ghana, because we are aiming that this tool can also be used outside Nigeria. So we decided to look at the different food items that were consumed all over Nigeria, not just the south, north, or east or west. So all the food groups that were included in the National Nutritional Guideline for Non-Communicable Disease of 2014 were all used in the construction of the Nigeria Dietary Screening Tool. Of all, we were able to identify 180 common food items that were consumed by Nigerians and they were included in our Nigerian Dietary Screening Tool.
Okay, so a follow-up question to that. Someone wants to know the 20 food groups that was used, and how it was categorized based on these classes you just said.
All right. What we did was, after we have identified the 180 food items, we used the 2019 West African food composition table to categorize this food. So the categorization of 180 item food were based on the food group that has already been identified and published by the West African food composition table. So with that, we were able to have fruit and vegetable. We have processed meat. We have eggs and egg products, and so on and so forth. So in all, we were able to identify 28 food groups. However, in our validation, we observed that some of these 28 food have the same mechanism of action and they have the same biological activity. Therefore, we combine them and then we were able to develop that 20 food groups.
Thank you very much, Dr. Matubo. We also have another question. Someone is asking, was there ethical approval before commencement? If yes, where was it gotten from?
All right. Let me take that again. We got ethical approval from the University of Leeds to conduct this study. And then we also got ethical approval from the Rivers State University Teaching Hospital to conduct this study. Going forward, we have also, which we are going to detail it more tomorrow, we have also gotten an approval and discussion with the Federal Ministry of Health to further refine and scale up this study all over Nigeria, with implementation study included in it. So tomorrow we are going to discuss more on policy and other aspects of the Nigerian Dietary Risk Score.
Okay. So another person is asking, taking into consideration the diversity of Nigerian dietary habits, could the NIDRS tool be applicable to the whole Nigeria?
Okay. Thank you. Now, in the first instance, the food groups and the food items that were included in the Nigerian Dietary Screening Tool were common food that is eaten by Nigerians all over Nigeria. So it is not a tool that was designed for only one particular ethnic group. So it is food group all the food groups that were included in the National Nutritional Guideline were included, and it is for every tribe, every region, especially considering the 6 geopolitical zone in Nigeria and all ethnic group. Now, if you look at our publication with that, you will see that even in the drink section, you will see some of the drinks that were included are not drinks that are particular for the southern part of Nigeria, but more of the northern part. So all the food groups, all the food items that are available in Nigeria were included. So it can be used by any Nigerian at any part of Nigeria.
Wow, thank you so much. Another participant would like to know how long you've been working on this, because this is a very impressive project. And they also want to know if you have plans of periodical reevaluation after general adoption in hospitals.
Okay, yeah, we have been working on this project for the past 4 years. We have been working on it for the past 4 years. We are approaching it in phases, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and till now we are still working on this same project going forward. Because right now, by tomorrow, you get to understand to do. Because we want to ensure we scale up the Nigerian dietary risk score, its applicability, usefulness across countries in all the low-income countries, because it was formulated, all the evidence that we are used was based on West African food, and at the same time, the Nigerian and Ghana food. So definitely, we're hoping to see more work coming up.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Batubo and Dr. Michael. We apologize for not getting to everyone's question, and we encourage you all to come back tomorrow. Thank you so much once again, Dr. Batubo and Dr. Michael. And we look forward to having you tomorrow. We have come to the end of today's presentation, and I hope you all learned a lot. I had fun and I learned a lot. I hope you did as well. Thank you so much, our facilitators. Please come back tomorrow and we'll continue from where we stopped. Thank you very much. I hope to see you again tomorrow. Good evening and goodbye.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.
Thank you, and see you tomorrow too.